Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a topic that touches on geography, geopolitics, and maybe even your personal aspirations. We're looking at the multifaceted perception of our northern neighbor, Canada, and also this intriguing, sometimes challenging idea of second passports for Americans. We've gathered a really insightful stack of sources for this deep dive. Some paint a picture of Canada as, well, a changing partner, potentially problematic even. Others highlight it as maybe the most valuable second passport an American could get. And then there's a third piece that talks broadly about the systemic challenges, maybe even threats, faced by anyone considering dual citizenship. So, our mission today is to extract the crucial nuggets of knowledge from these diverse and, yeah, at times contradictory viewpoints. We want to give you a comprehensive, nuanced understanding that goes, beyond just the headlines.
Yeah, and what's compelling here, I think, is how these sources really force us to challenge assumptions. Assumptions about a nation we often just sort of take for granted. We'll explore the specific points they raise, not to take a side, obviously, but to help you understand the full spectrum of arguments and the implications surrounding Canada, plus the broader complexities of dual citizenship for Americans. It's quite a mix. Absolutely. So traditionally, for over a century, Canada's been seen as, you know, the quiet, polite neighbor to the north, a steadfast ally, trusted trading partner, sort of a cultural cousin. We share the longest undefended border, a long history of military, economic, diplomatic cooperation. That's the baseline, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. One of our sources argues that beneath this long-standing partnership, and I'm quoting here, troubling trends have emerged in Canada's domestic and foreign policy. And these raise legitimate concerns for Americans. It suggests that while calling Canada a terrorist nation is, quote, inaccurate, its current political direction presents what they describe as ideological, strategic, and national security challenges. Exactly. This source really urges us to look beyond that surface politeness. So, if we unpack the key areas of concern they highlight, the first one is Canada's evolving foreign policy, particularly its ambiguous stance toward authoritarian regimes like China. That's a direct quote. There have been accusations, quite public ones, that Canadian officials have downplayed the threat of Chinese interference in their elections, their institutions. You might remember the intelligence leaks in 2023. They apparently revealed troubling patterns of CCP influence operations, that's the Chinese Communist Party, targeting Canadian politics, media, academia.
Okay, so if Canada is seen as susceptible to that kind of foreign manipulation, what's the actual knock-on effect for U.S. interests, especially thinking about security alliances?
Well, that's the core of the argument, isn't it? A nation seen as vulnerable to foreign influence poses, well, a direct risk, particularly when you think about military coordination and intelligence sharing. Things like NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and the Five Eyes Alliance, our critical intelligence network with key partners. These things depend entirely on mutual integrity and strategic alignment, as the source puts it. Any perceived weakness there is a problem. Then there's another area the source brings up, Canada's approach to multiculturalism. Now, while that's broadly celebrated, this particular source suggests it's raised some national security concerns. They point to Canada's broad policies of cultural accommodation, including, this is their phrasing, the legal protection of radical or extremist elements under the banner of diversity. What? They do note that, of course, most Canadian Muslims are peaceful. But they also say Canadian intelligence agencies have documented the presence of radical Islamist sympathizers operating within what they call Canada's relatively permissive legal environment.
And the argument is that this isn't just an internal Canadian matter, right? It potentially affects the U.S. too.
Not at all, according to this view. The argument is that ideological extremism, if unchecked, creates vulnerabilities for the entire North American security apparatus. I quote. So from this perspective, the U.S. can't really afford to ignore how Canadian immigration, refugee, and integration policies, quote, may create safe harbors for actors who reject Western democratic values. That's the fear expressed. Moving to domestic issues, the source cites the rapid expansion of euthanasia through Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program, MAID. This is highlighted as a really significant departure from, well, what they see as traditional American values. This program is now available even to people suffering from mental illness or chronic poverty. Now, the critics cited in this source view it as a dangerous failure of social responsibility, basically treating death as a solution to systemic issues like homelessness or inadequate health care. And this, they argue, reflects a broader ideological shift that departs from the sanctity of life values cherished in American society.
Wow, that's a pretty strong claim about a fundamental divergence in values. What else is seen as contributing to this philosophical divide they're talking about?
Well, another area mentioned is Canada's strict speech codes and human rights tribunals. This source claims that laws targeting hate speech and offensive language, and those terms can be broadly interpreted, often end up criminalizing legitimate political discourse and silence critics. And this reflects, in their view, a growing philosophical divide on the limits of state power versus individual freedom, especially when you compare it to American First Amendment protections. Border security also gets highlighted. The U.S.-Canada border, which was once, a model of cooperation, is described here as having become a soft entry point for illegal immigration and transnational crime. They cite U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports showing record numbers of illegal crossings in northern states like New York and Vermont in 2022 and 2023, and Canada's generous immigration and asylum policies are seen by this source as increasing the risk. Risks like human trafficking, smuggling, and maybe even infiltration by individuals with hostile intent.
And finally, they touch on the economic and environmental side of things, too.
Right. Canada's aggressive carbon taxation, its restrictions on resource extraction, these green energy mandates, they're increasingly seen as out of sync with American energy policy, particularly in, say, conservative or resource-dependent U.S. states. And this, in the source's view, strains cross-border industries and reflects deeper conflicts and national priorities. It's not just policy, it's about fundamental direction.
Okay, so according to this particular perspective, what does this all boil down to? What should the U.S. do about this relationship?
Well, the source suggests the U.S. really needs to reevaluate its relationship, to adopt a posture of scrutiny, not assumption, and to increase strategic monitoring. It actually goes quite far. It recommends that American citizens should avoid non-essential travel and migration to Canada until these differences are addressed, because, in their words, Canada no longer guarantees the safe, stable environment it once did, which is a pretty stark conclusion.
It really is. But wait, because there's definitely another side to this story, a completely different lens, really. Another source we looked at paints a starkly different picture, arguing that getting Canadian citizenship is, and I quote, like creating another state for yourself, providing full membership in a stable, prosperous G7 nation with enormous economic, social, and geopolitical advantages. Quite the contrast.
It really is a compelling counter-narrative, especially for Americans thinking about options. First, this perspective emphasizes the incredible access Canadian citizenship provides. Access to markets and communities in Mexico, South America, Europe. Canada's got these extensive trade agreements, right?
Okay.
Like USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Suite, and the CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. These apparently open doors to some of the world's fastest-growing economies. The argument is this significantly elevates an American's value to partners in those regions. It leads to easier business dealings, maybe richer cultural and social connections. You become part of a broader global network.
So it's not just about Canada itself, but the doors it opens internationally, the global reach it offers.
Precisely. And secondly, there's the exclusivity factor. Canadian citizenship grants entry into what this source calls an exclusive and prestigious community. They estimate about 1 million citizens worldwide, which is, remarkably, less than 0.001% of the global population. And this exclusivity, they argue, reflects Canada's careful approach to immigration and citizenship. It helps maintain a high-quality society with strong social cohesion and exceptional standards of living. So it remains a rare and respected status, symbolizing stability, democracy, and progressive values. Thirdly, there's the quality of life argument. Canada offers an attractive alternative, they say, with low immigration relative to its size, which this source suggests helps preserve social harmony, supports excellent healthcare, education, and public services that are among the best in the world. It provides a safety net and an enhanced quality of life for you and your family. Plus, you get a passport that facilitates travel and business worldwide without the typical restrictions or red tape that sometimes comes with other passports.
That definitely paints a picture of a desirable lifestyle. And what about Canada's standing on the world stage? How does that play in?
Yeah, the geopolitical angle is important too. Canada's role as a G7 country, a global leader on issues like climate change, human rights, peacekeeping. This further increases the strategic value of its citizenship, according to this view. Becoming Canadian, this source suggests, aligns you with a nation respected for its rule of law, democratic institutions, and international influence, which can effectively amplify your personal and professional stature on the world stage. It adds a certain weight.
It's just such a different picture being painted here, isn't it? From a nation potentially causing concern to, well, an almost unmatched opportunity. It really highlights the vastly different ways a country can be perceived, depending on the criteria and the priorities you're looking at.
Absolutely. But this raises another important question, though. kind of a complicating layer. Beyond the specifics of Canada, our sources also give us insights into the general systemic challenges. Maybe even, as one source puts it, real threats that potentially face Americans holding any second passport, particularly from places like Canada, Mexico, or Europe.
That's right. And one of the sources uses incredibly strong language here. It suggests these factors contribute to tensions that, quote, may escalate into terrorist-like threats against this vulnerable community. Now, it's important to unpack that phrase, terrorist-like threats. The source seems to be using it metaphorically to describe intense systemic pressures and vulnerabilities dual nationals might face, almost like a psychological or professional targeting rather than necessarily physical violence. So let's guide you through the threats outlined, starting with what they call threats within the country, meaning within the U.S.
Right. The core idea presented here is that U.S. citizenship itself is viewed, maybe implicitly, as this incredibly exclusive, highly guarded asset. It favors birthright and legacy, as the source puts it. They highlight that even for people who've lived and worked legally in the U.S. for years, the path to actually getting citizenship is often narrow, expensive, and highly restrictive. And for Americans specifically looking for a second passport, the financial threshold mentioned is typically at least $2 million, just as a starting point for some roads.
$2 million just to potentially start the process for certain types of second passports. That's an incredible barrier. What does that tell us about the perceived value or maybe the gatekeeping around U.S. citizenship itself?
Well, it implies that American citizenship is seen as so valuable or perhaps so tightly controlled that acquiring other citizenships is viewed through a lens of extreme privilege or maybe even suspicion. And it makes other citizenships seem almost secondary, or certainly not easily acquired by just anyone, according to this view. Then we have threats outside the country. The source argues that getting citizenship abroad is even harder, because, they claim, immigration systems prioritize certain countries, races, and social classes.
So it's suggesting the process isn't neutral at all. There are built-in biases.
Far from neutral, according to this perspective. It suggests the process gets harder. The further one is from whiteness, wealth, or Western alignment. Citizenship, this source claims, acts more like exclusive access than a right. Many get denied entry even before they can formally apply. They note that outsiders, meaning non-Americans trying to get into the U.S. first, might need to be worth $10 million and could face waiting periods up to 30 years to obtain U.S. citizenship before they could even realistically consider seeking other citizenships like Canada's later on. The bar is set incredibly high in both directions, according to this analysis.
Wow, those are some stark numbers and claims. And the source also points to threats from religion and race. What's the core concept there? It sounds potentially very controversial.
It is strong language, definitely. This source highlights that beneath the surface of immigration policies, historical biases can persist, shaping perceptions. They use this very provocative phrasing, stating that citizenship and national identity are often viewed as possessions of a white superior or Jesus figure. Now, this is meant to convey how, in their specific view, racial discrimination is embedded in immigration policy and procedures. They give the example of black applicants facing systemic racism through biased application filters, background checks, and merit-based selections, experiencing higher scrutiny, denial rates, and delays. And even after getting citizenship, they might remain questioned and seen as outsiders. It's a claim about deeply ingrained bias.
That's a powerful and, frankly, deeply unsettling observation from the source about the systemic nature of these challenges. And what about the economic angle?
Economically, the source makes another really bold claim. They state that immigrants face indirect enslavement. Now, they use this extremely strong term to characterize what they see as grueling conditions, long work hours, high fees, and years of uncertainty that many immigrants might endure. Even with citizenship, they argue, immigrants are often viewed as inferior to those born here, that just solely or right of the soil concept. In this view, economic contribution becomes the sole measure of worth. Your value is purely transactional. And the source adds this specific point. During certain wartime conditions, low-income Americans retain superiority over wealthy foreigners due to U.S. military strength, nuclear missiles, soldiers, which ironically makes wealthy foreigners, even those with second passports, potential targets of resentment or suspicion.
So it's suggesting this deep-seated hierarchy based on birth, wealth, national origin that persists even after someone obtains a second passport. What about threats from actual authorities?
This point suggests that authorities themselves, maybe border agents, immigration officials, can display envy and suspicion toward dual nationals. questioning their advantages, their potential threats, challenging the very legitimacy of holding a second passport, or even questioning their professional status. It speaks to a subtle, maybe sometimes not so subtle, yet pervasive form of scrutiny or discrimination.
And finally, there's this really fascinating, almost conspiratorial-sounding idea they mention, threats from an international community secret agenda. What's that about?
Yeah, that one's quite abstract. This specific source suggests that if your second passport happens to be from a neighboring country, like Canada or Mexico,
Yeah.
you can possess value as part of something presumptively greater.
Hmm.
It seems to be implying this larger, maybe theoretical agenda towards a unified North and/or South American continent, like a geopolitical bloc. And this perceived greater value, ironically, can draw suspicion or envy from other international players outside North America. Those players might view such unification, even if hypothetical, as a threat to their own global standing. It's a very geopolitical, almost shadowy kind of threat perception.
It's certainly a lot to take in. Very complex layers here.
It truly is. And what's crucial, I think, is remembering these are described as deeply embedded systemic issues. They seem to transcend the specific country of the second passport, according to this source. They paint a complex picture of challenges for dual nationals, regardless of where that second citizenship comes from, highlighting biases that are often overlooked in simpler discussions.
So, okay, what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to absorb all these layers of information? We've unpacked Canada as, well, both a potential concern and a really valuable opportunity. And all of that is set against this backdrop of the very real systemic challenges that, according to one source, can come with dual citizenship for Americans in general.
Yeah, if we try to connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
our sources really present a clear dichotomy, don't they? On one hand, you have this call for a sober reassessment of a key alliance, focusing on perceived risks. On the other, a really enthusiastic endorsement of Canadian citizenship, focusing on opportunity. And then this third layer introduces these inherent vulnerabilities and biases that might impact any dual national. It just highlights how perceptions and realities, both in international relations and in personal choices, can be deeply complex, even contradictory.
Which really leaves us with an important question for you to consider, doesn't it? In a world where one nation, like Canada, can be simultaneously viewed as a shifting ally and an unmatched personal asset, while the very act of obtaining a second passport, any second passport, might carry its own set of deep systemic challenges. How do you truly weigh the perceived risks against the potential rewards? How do you navigate such conflicting narratives when making your own personal or professional decisions? Something to think about.